Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, I can certainly speak for 20 minutes and 30 minutes and 40 minutes about this important topic, and I'm certainly happy today to stand in this House and report stage for C-56. Madam Speaker, we've been talking about competition quite a bit in this House. The need for competition, the lack of competition. We know that Canada has a competition problem, and we see it in every sector that Canadians are part of. That includes cell phones, that includes banking, that includes grocery, that includes our wireless and internet. There's not really a sector in the Canadian economy that is not dominated by oligopolies and monopolies. So of course, when this bill came along, we looked at it favorably because it had certain aspects that were going to be improved. Mostly we looked at it favorably because they were conservative aspects that were being part of that, which included my private member's bill, which was read into the Act, and of course I have a new private member's bill, so we're all happy for that and we're moving on. But Madam Speaker, the crux of this bill, and the bill is called the Affordable Grocery and Housing Act, is really anticlimactic in the fact that when this bill receives royal assent and this bill becomes law, that will not really change the fact that Canadians are still paying the highest grocery fees and Canadians are in the worst housing crisis in this country's history. And that's only because this Act does promise to make some changes to the Competition Act. This Act does do some minor tinkering around the edges for what we need to have changed in the Act. But it doesn't do the real hard work. It doesn't take the courage to change the real things that need to happen to change competition in Canada. The bill enacts Competition Act changes. It certainly makes some provisions, some changes to abusive dominance. It looks at eliminating the efficiencies defense. That was my private member's bill that came forward. It looks at how market studies should be handled by the Competition Bureau itself. But when it comes to the real aspects that are hurting consumers at the grocery store right now, when they're paying 20% more for groceries after 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, it does not tackle the biggest aspect, which is the carbon tax. The carbon tax, which is added to the farmer, to the trucker, to the manufacturer, to the cold storage facility, which is added 1, 2, 3, 4 times to the consumer bill and passed on to the consumer. It certainly doesn't tackle the fact that when it comes to housing in Canada, we're building less homes now than we did in 1972, with over 40 million Canadians in this country right now. It certainly doesn't tackle the fact that because of high inflation after 8 years, that costs of everything have gone up, building materials for homes, labor for homes. The fact that over the years, we've built up a big barrier of what we call NIMBYism, protecting backyards from others so that we can't build homes. And consumers, Madam Speaker, are stretched. Mortgage renewals are coming due, and over 70% of Canadians with a fixed mortgage will have to renew their mortgage over the next 2 years. This during the fastest run-up of interest rates on the whole history of this country. You know, the carbon tax had unintended consequences, and consumers are screaming for it at the end. They were promised that the fact that they would get more back in rebate than they put in. But the unintended consequences have been that those carbon taxes have added costs to grocery bills. Those added costs have gone on to the price of almost everything that Canadians are paying. And when they see the rebate they get in their hand based on the bills that they pay each and every day, Canadians know now, and Canadians are smart, that they are paying way more in those carbon taxes than they're getting in rebates. And after 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, they cannot afford any more. When we look to competition, we looked at 2 parts of the Act that we need to solidify. One is we put a stranglehold at how big the big, bossy, dominant conglomerates, oligopolies, and monopolies can get in Canada, and Canadians have had enough. Whether it's cell phone bills, where we have 3 companies that control 90% of all cell phones in Canada, which are, by the way, the most expensive 3 carriers out of 128 carriers in 64 countries. Or whether it's groceries, where we used to have in Canada competition, 8 grocery stores. They used to run and compete with one another and drive prices lower, which are now down to only 3 Canadian companies competing with 2 American conglomerates. They used to be all Canadian competitors. We used to be able to go to different stores and find them. And now Canadians find that they oftentimes go to the same competitors. So obviously, prices haven't gone down. And this is only after the last 8 years in a Competition Act that was outdated, was certainly outlived its prime when the Competition Act was created based on a 1960s industrial policy that said, we want Canadian companies to get as big as possible to compete internationally. It's actually in the purpose clause of the Competition Act right now, to make Canadian companies as big as possible so they can compete internationally. That's what we deem as competition. But when it comes to competition, meaning we want more companies to compete, not internationally, but to compete for Canadians' dollars, because Canadian companies should not be able to make all their money on the backs of hard-working Canadians. Canadian companies need to compete with one another for Canadians' hard-earned tax dollar. And so, the breadth of this Competition Act, which needs to be changed, is the premise, it's the purpose of the Competition Act. The number one, we need to ensure that big, bossy conglomerations, corporations can't get bigger on the backs of hardworking Canadians. But the second most important aspect of the Competition Act is to ensure we have competition, or we have startups in Canada. Madam Speaker, Canada now, according to the BDC, has 100,000 fewer entrepreneurs compared to 20 years ago, despite our population increasing by over 10 million people. Canada has failed to create competition. So we can look at one aspect to say, we really would love to make sure we stifle the top monopolies and oligopolies and make sure that they can't merge with one another. But the other big problem we've missed along the whole way is to have startups be created to compete with one another. You know, it used to be that Canada was the bastion for that we would be able to find startups and great Canadian companies start up and grow and scale. And for the first time in our history, we have less startups per capita than ever before after 8 years of this government. You know, when we talk about new jobs and we talk about creating wealth in this country, something that I'm afraid we're going to have to speak about a lot over the next year, we look to small business and we look to startups to fulfill that role. 97% of all new jobs in Canada are created by small business. So when we look at the complexity, but also the value of these small businesses, men and women who can take a risk and start something new in Canada, right now what we're missing most of all is to ensure that we create those jobs and businesses in this nation. You know, at the end of the day, we have to really look at what this is going to do and what this is not going to do. We're certainly going to vote for this legislation. At the end of the day, the Competition Bureau itself has been ignored for the last 8 years. You know, the first time that this government starts talking about it, coincidentally, is the first time when the opposition leader named a competition shadow minister for the first time in government, which looked at the importance to what competition can do for the nation and what competition means for Canadians. And of course, the first thing it means is prices. But the second thing, of course, it means are jobs and it's paychecks. Because when we can create new startups and new businesses, when we look at the banking sector, for instance, the biggest thing that we're trying to put forward is consumer-led or open banking. You know, there's an opportunity where this government's been dragging its feet to create hundreds upon hundreds of financial tech institutions who can not only create jobs and paychecks for Canadians, but provide options for Canadians who are to put their hard-earned money when it comes to financial services in Canada. I would hope that through this, and we'll be talking about it when we get back in January, this government introduces that legislation that it promised in 2018. But more importantly, as this bill, of course called the Affordable Housing and Groceries Act, comes forth, Canadians are going to be angry about how anticlimactic this bill will be. Grocery prices are not going to go down after this bill is passed, nor will our housing crisis be solved. It does something important for the Competition Act, but not nearly anything to undo what has already been done. And most importantly, it does not create startups that have stopped, the startups that can create and drive housing starts and create more options and more food in the value chain. Madam Speaker, we need boldness, we need courage, and a new government to present policy that will actually create homes and grow food without punishing our farmers in this country. It's time to bring it home for farmers, for our country, and for Canadians looking for a home of their own. Thank you, Madam Speaker.